Hi, thank you for coming today. Welcome. We are discussing agriculture and the environment. So come on in. Thank you very much for your time and your attention. This presentation only has about 4 slides, but I can get long-winded, so we'll see how long it takes. But otherwise, welcome. Thanks again, and let us get started. So, again, the topic is agriculture and the environment. Agriculture is a huge sector of human existence. Obviously, there's a lot that goes into it, a lot of inputs, a lot of resources, and a lot that comes out, obviously, in way of foodstuffs and more natural resources that we can use for energy, etc. So lots and lots going on in way of agriculture. But looking at spheres of reach today, we are going to be looking at runoff as a concern, an environmental concern, agriculture to feed agriculture. So how the more we need agriculture, the more agriculture we need. The water footprint of agriculture and agriculture for energy, as well as greenhouse gas. So we are going to start off with runoff. It has been a consistent concern when it comes to agriculture. We have, it's because we don't rotate the ground that we have our plots of crops on, our row crops, our big fields. We don't generally move those to fresh soil. They are stationary. Even if we do crop rotations, we don't move that land, and so the soil quality does tend to decrease over time, just because constant use, constant nutrient absorption, and we maintain them in such a way that there isn't a lot of decomposition that happens organically with the plants, just because a lot of the materials can be recycled, used for, say, ethanol, or used in silage to feed the animals. But that we'll get to that part too, of course, in agriculture, to feed agriculture. But because the soil quality does seem to decrease over time, I read a book and it actually suggested that if you go to places where the fields have been used consistently for years and years and years, you can sometimes just go and pick up just dust, which is, they argued, not soil but actually just dirt, dust. So you can actually look at other fields, and the soil kind of clumps together. It has moisture retained, and that's meant to kind of signify more soil health. It's a darker black versus like a light brown, and so there you can see a difference in soil health. But we are also looking at runoff, because if we don't have that natural soil health, a lot of times we try to supplement it with materials such as compost or fertilizers. So those can be unnatural. They can be comprised of nitrogen and phosphorus. So we put those on the fields along with the crops, and then if we are not mindful about when we put it on, it can very easily be washed away be washed into local waterways. It can kind of permeate the subsurface of the ground and find its way into the water table that way. So it's a good idea be mindful. And there are, of course, best practices in way of timing. I read about it. I can't remember off the top of my head if it. I don't work in this sphere, but I believe it was between rains. So that there's a few days time for it to actually permeate and be uptaken by the crops before we have to factor in where it will go when it rains and how much it rains and things like that. And of course, depending on the season, you could have flooding, and so that is a science in and of itself, when and how to apply fertilizers. But runoff is a concern. If we get enough nitrogen in our waterways, we can have a eutrophication process that occurs where life is abundant, and then it starts to the balance becomes lost and everything becomes green, and then everything's competing for the resources instead of maintaining that balance, and so then everything starts to die off. So with runoff, you want to be careful just because of the chemicals that are involved. They can be very helpful for a lot of different plants, and if the balance is thrown off in places that don't need that extra kick of nutrients, you could have problems. So that is one sphere where the environment and agriculture do coincide. It is very much, those fields are very much a man-made ecosystem there, so maintaining it is our responsibility, of course. So agriculture to feed agriculture, and we kind of did just brush on this a little bit with soil health, but agriculture to feed agriculture. So obviously we have a lot of animals to feed human beings, to feed other animals, and so that takes agriculture in and of itself to feed those feedstocks. So we need, as well as water, so, and that goes back to the water footprint too, but the more feed we need to go towards livestock, the more agricultural outputs that do not end up on our tables. So less for us. We also need agriculture for energy too, and we'll brush on that in a second. But the less competition we have for those resources, the more arguably the more quality of life we can give to everyone here. So if we are able to work together to maintain a balance and figure out best practices for how much livestock we need, and if we can reduce the amount of livestock that we need, it's a pretty rough equation because livestock also feeds agriculture, of course, so it's the relationship there can be mutual, just because livestock animals can eat the food, and then for cows, for example, the fecal matter that they produce can be used as like a liquid fertilizer. So then that would go onto the fields to help proliferate life in that sector. So that's a good parallel there, but if you have too much fertilizer, you can sell it and perhaps make a profit. A lot of it, I've heard, does go directly on the fields that are associated with that particular farm. So kind of self-sustaining systems, which is great. We also have silage is fermented leftover crops stalks, or they might not be like the leaves, but they are edible as like a type of feed for livestock like cows. You put them in the silos, and those monitor temperature, and you can add moisture, and it can ferment a little bit to get the appropriate microbiota to potentially boost nutrient value. But you have to be careful. If it gets too hot, of course, you might have, there might be a flame potential there. So you do have to monitor your silo, your silage, if you are to use it, but it's a great way to use those extra crops or plant, leftovers to help feed the animals, and then again the animals will poop it out and then put that on the field. So that's another way to maintain that balance. So that's that. Water footprint. Obviously water goes to feed animals in agriculture. It also goes on the fields. I actually read this, and I apologize, I am just trying to quote this from memory, and I'm not the greatest at remembering numbers, but I think it was about 80% of our potable water goes to agriculture. We have a lot of water that goes to agriculture, and you can hear discussions about different ways to water row crops. You still do see a lot of just your basic sprinkler systems, and so that is the traditional method, at least where I'm at. But you can also hear about drip lines that are in. You can see where they build in like a reservoir beneath the fields, and then that collects excess water, and then you can recycle that water and use it to water the fields again. It's a big sector because obviously we do want to maintain sustainable systems, and we don't want to overreach on that water footprint. The same article said we use about 80% of our potable water on agriculture, and as human beings we tend to overuse what's remaining, what we have, and so we are consistently using more water than is available to us on a regular basis. And I'm actually from Minnesota, and so we are the land of 10,000 lakes. So we don't hear about water shortages too often up here in the Midwest, but we are very fortunate in that regard. I have heard that places down south were hoping to get a pipeline to Lake Superior so they would have more access to fresh water. There is a potential for converting ocean water to potable water. However, it's an expensive process, and so a lot of people don't much care for that as an investment. But if there are other options anyway, but that is an option. I've heard that they were interested in that. I've also heard that I actually visited down south, New Mexico, and there was a water shortage, and so they said you cannot shower every day. You cannot do it. It's every other day right now for about 5 minutes, because there is not enough water in this desert area for the people that are here. And so we are very fortunate where we are up in Minnesota, and so that's something to bear in mind, that water is a resource, and it is a glorious resource to have in abundance, and we need to be mindful of our footprint there. And the article said we're going to overreach how much water we use with how much water we have. It's going to be about 160%. So we need how much water we have available to us plus half that to get by, which that math does not figure. So that's not good. And of course, this was one source. I mean, you can read it in all sorts of different places, and water footprints are quoted there are so many different numbers that you'll come up with, you'll see. So it's a tough one to actually land on how much water we're using and where, when, and how. We can look directly at specific places. You can check your own, water meters, and you check your water bill. And a lot of businesses, especially agriculture, they, have conferences where they can talk about things like this and bring case studies of how much water is being used and how they are putting in R&D to change that footprint and to try and make things more streamlined and more sustainable. So that's really, really cool to see in industries like agriculture. It would be cool to see it in other industries as well. You see commercial establishments sometimes will ascribe to green initiatives, and so that's a cool one to bring to the forefront of the conversation, because we have the power. We the people can make a difference on this, and we can be mindful of what we're supporting with our dollars, and we can build the world that we want. So it's pretty cool, but we want to be mindful of that water footprint with agriculture as well as just in general, your own personal water footprint. So agriculture for energy, ethanol. Ethanol is a very big energy producer. We put 1% to 2% in gasoline. You hear, rumors of adding more. Ethanol is like your traditional fossil fuel, good old-fashioned gas from the gas station, except it's not as powerful. That's why they just do like a 1% to 2% in your gas mix. I think it can go higher, but I can't remember exactly the highest I've seen. But we do use a lot of crops for things that are that are not for food for the people. So this is something that we might take for granted, the amount of resources that goes into ethanol production, that goes into fueling our cars, which is why we have a lot of initiatives about electric cars. You can get the tax credit. Of course, I did hear that with the current politics, some of that stuff is going away. They are trying to take those off the table to get those tax credits for electric vehicles. And I know there was an initiative to have everyone in a hybrid by 2035. Now that's off the table. It's on the table. It's off the table. So we had that. I think I heard about it in California, and then it sounded like Minnesota was interested in it as well. And I am pro that as well too, if I can afford it. But they're becoming more and more popular vehicles now, and so there are more options and more affordable options. I actually did see an electric vehicle that was about $20,000, brand new, which is definitely better than the $100,000 of some of the nicer ones, and 100,000 plus, I think, is where that goes. But the real fancy ones. Yeah, so we just want to be mindful of how much ethanol, how much fossil fuel gas we are using. The fossil fuels obviously also go to virgin plastics and all sorts of other materials, and so we, if we can use that for the other materials, fossil fuels are finite. We don't know how many we're going to have available to us and for how long. Consistently, I read another article that suggested that we're going to run out of fossil fuels, gasoline and oil, within the next, what was it, 30 years, but the article also said, but it's been the next X number of years for 1 year, 2 year, 5 years, 10 years. So we don't know. Obviously, we've got drilling offshore now as well. So we don't know how much of that we are going to have available to us. They have biofuels that are coming in, and bioplastics and things. So it is another R&D puzzle to figure out. So that is something to bear in mind. But a lot of that agriculture does go to ethanol production, and so we have a lot to sustain. It's not as simple as just, okay, well, we don't have to eat as much, and it's a very large equation, and maintaining sustainability there can be difficult. And if there's like flour shortages or other crop shortages, you might see that happen, and so we just want to be mindful of that. So greenhouse gases, they obviously you're working with soil and dirt, and sometimes there is nitrogen naturally in that soil, and so they have come up with like no-till systems and ways, because when you till, the soil gets stirred up and it has more of the soil surface area that connects with the oxygen, and you can have the nitrogen oxygen chemical reaction where you get more gases in the atmosphere, and then you have more greenhouse gases that are clouding the atmosphere and keeping the heat and heat particles in our atmosphere versus allowing them to reflect back out into outer space. So they have come up with like no-till systems, so that way that soil is not stirred up as much and you have fewer chemical reactions, and trying to just cut out some of that extra noise and some of the in space, and so in our atmosphere. So that is some of the spheres of reach where agriculture and the environment can collide in ways that may be negative in way of sustainability and balance. There are other relevant agricultural initiatives that kind of can be reflected in the environment, and that is such things as soil health, which we sort of touched on already, as well as beneficial insects. They have been talking about potentially having like crops next to cash crops or smaller crops next to the larger crops that take all summer to develop and be able to harvest. You can have smaller crops next to the bigger crops, so that way you have those small ones to to bring in some revenue, as well as to potentially have elements die off, and then they can be decomposing next to the other crops, so that way the beneficial insects will come in, they will help the decomposition process, they will leave their fecal matter, which adds to the nitrogen content, and then the soil will have more nutrients right there on site. So that's kind of a thought process that you will hear of. They also have like buffer zones around fields that they will have the wildflowers with beneficial insects there, so they can kind of live in those buffer zones, and then also help in the areas with the crop rows. Then those buffer rows will also help absorb any water that is trying to run off and get that nitrogen into a place where it's beneficial to all of the plants in that buffer zone before it hits the larger waterways. So it acts as a filter system. So that is another option in way of spaces for beneficial insects and where those can be in those agricultural spaces. Crop rotation is also a thing that is used for soil health, also crop health too, because they can decompose. Some crops might have longer stalks that are more easily recycled and used as silage or as ethanol, an ethanol feedstock, and so if you do a crop rotation, there might be more that can decompose and add nutrients to the soil. You can also, they use different nutrients potentially. Different plants might use different nutrients, and so that too will give some of the other nutrients time to kind of replenish and rebound from the uses that were just used. Also, they cut back on diseases. If a disease does strike a crop, if you have the same crop the next year, it might be more likely to get the same disease and get sick again. So if you are constantly moving around, that can help with that crop rotation just to maintain crop health. So you can be mindful of that, and you can maybe coordinate and figure out how to meet the demands of the current market in way of supply and demand. You might need a farmers cooperative, because you do need to maintain an income, and so you might have to look at governmental assistance programs there as well, and that just comes down to a lot of communication and knowing your market. So permaculture is also a thing that has been talked about. Permaculture is comparable to the idea of like having row crops with cash crops or smaller crops intermixed. I also heard even just having like rows of wildflowers between the row crops. But permaculture is less row and less structure, potentially, where it's a more natural environment. And so you can look at what nutrients different plants need, if you've got the science available to you, like the tools, that you can figure out what feeds on what gives what, replenishes. And so you can work out, if you've heard of like the Three Sisters crops, Native American crops, you've got the three crops that kind of subsist and work together, and it's like the corn acts as the trellis for the bean plants as they crawl upwards, and then you've got the squash as well. So they all kind of work together. But with permaculture, they might be less traditional, like heirloom vegetables, or they might not be the same. They might be more organic, or it's tough to think of those like food plants out in the natural, wild environment. But at one point, they were like a wild environment type plant. But having it in a more lifelike wildlife area, and of course you can hear too of having like livestock walking through the fields and kind of pooping as they forage around areas. So you can have that in as a potential option for if they can forage in those crop rows, if they do have more plants involved. But yeah, permaculture, you can have that wildlife. You can have squirrels versus just the agricultural animals that are foraging, and so it's meant to be more open, more organic. But if you're mindful about it, with that balance of, you can have like the fruit trees and then have the veggies on the ground, and just all interconnected. Like the Garden of Eden was one interpretation of it. So those are examples of what you can do in way of agricultural initiatives that are meant to kind of build the wild environment. And those same things you can see in conservation efforts and in the wild environment as well, because invasives can take over, and you would go in and try and recreate the natural environment and try and boost the numbers if balance has been lost. And so these same principles can be seen in wild areas too. So just a little blurb on agriculture and the environment. Are there any questions? Any questions at all? Otherwise, we're going to wrap it up. That is the presentation. A little bit short today, but I think we hit everything that we wanted to. I hope you have a great day, and we will see you next time. Thanks so much.